Have you ever been talked to in a way that makes you feel small without anyone actually raising their voice? The kind of disrespect that's quiet, casual, almost lazy, but somehow hits harder than yelling ever could, because it tells you one simple thing: this person doesn't see you as an equal. That's where my story starts, not with shouting, not with drama, but with one sentence spoken so confidently that it stayed with me long after my shift ended. I'm a woman who has worked retail for 3 years. 3 years of standing under bright lights that never turn off, smiling at strangers who assume my time is less valuable than theirs, apologizing for policies I didn't create, prices I didn't set, and stock I don't control. Retail teaches you control. It teaches you how to swallow reactions, how to soften your tone even when someone sharpens theirs, how to smile through comments that feel unnecessary at best and humiliating at worst. Most days, I'm good at it. I tell myself it's temporary. I tell myself people are stressed. I tell myself not to take it personally. But some days, someone says something that cuts just deep enough to remind you that no matter how professional you are, you're still human. That morning, I already felt off. Not dramatic, just worn down. My feet hurt before my shift even really started. The store smelled like plastic and cardboard, and the same playlist was looping songs I could practically recite from memory. Customers came and went, some polite, some impatient, most forgettable. I was doing what I always do, scanning items, answering questions, keeping my voice light, my posture open, my expression neutral. Then I noticed him. He walked in like he was already losing an argument with the world. Middle-aged, well-dressed, confident in the way people get when they believe money automatically puts them in charge. His shoulders were tense, his face tight, his eyes scanning shelves like we'd personally disappointed him by existing incorrectly. He didn't browse. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward me with purpose, the kind that says he expects results, not conversation. I greeted him, polite, friendly, automatic. He didn't respond. He just named a speaker model, sharp and clipped, like he was giving a command instead of asking for help. I pulled it up in our system, already knowing how this usually goes. When I saw the screen, my stomach dipped slightly. Sold out. Completely. No hidden stock, no miracle in the back room. I took a breath and did my job. I explained calmly that we were sold out but offered solutions immediately. I could check other nearby locations. I could order it online for him at the same sale price. Reasonable options. Helpful options. The exact things we're trained to offer in situations like this. That's when his expression changed. He finally looked at me, really looked at me, and his face twisted into something between disbelief and irritation. He let out a small laugh, the kind that isn't amused, just dismissive. Then he leaned slightly forward, invading my space just enough to remind me who he thought had the upper hand, and said, "Are you stupid? Just check the back." The words hit me before I had time to prepare for them. I felt my shoulders tense, my jaw tighten. There was that instant heat behind my eyes, that sharp sting that comes when someone insults your intelligence in front of other people like it's a fact, not an opinion. He didn't sound angry. He sounded certain. Like the idea that I might know what I was doing never even crossed his mind. In that moment, 1,000 thoughts ran through my head. I wanted to explain inventory systems. I wanted to tell him we don't hide products just to inconvenience customers. I wanted to ask him if he talked to people like this outside of stores. But retail doesn't reward honesty, it rewards compliance. So I did what I've been trained to do. I smiled, not a warm smile, not a genuine one, just enough to look polite. I nodded and said, "Sure, sir. I'll check the back." As I walked away, I could feel my heart pounding. The stockroom door swung shut behind me, cutting off the noise of the store, and the silence hit hard. Shelves stacked with boxes, cold lighting, no customers, no audience. I stood there, perfectly still, for 3 full minutes, not searching, not pretending, just standing there, replaying his words over and over. "Are you stupid?" Each repetition landed heavier than the last, because it wasn't just about the speaker. It was about how easily some people decide who deserves respect and who doesn't. When I finally walked back out, my face was calm, my voice steady. I told him we didn't have any in the back. He sighed like I'd personally failed him, like my existence had wasted his time. No apology, no acknowledgement. He just grabbed a different speaker. More expensive, not on sale, his choice. I rang it up while he scrolled on his phone. Tapping his foot, already mentally gone. His card approved. Transaction complete. And that should have been the end. But as I reached for the receipt, something quiet settled in my chest. Not anger, not rage, just awareness. I knew our return policy inside and out. I knew how inconvenient returns could be without a receipt. I folded it carefully, smaller, tighter, until it was barely recognizable as paper. I bagged his purchase, taped it shut, slipped it into another bag, taped that too, and tucked the receipt between the layers where tape met plastic. Hidden, not destroyed, just inconvenient. I handed him the bag and smiled. Have a great day. He took it without looking at me and walked out, convinced the interaction was over. And as the door closed behind him, I felt something loosen inside me, not pride, not guilt, just a quiet sense of balance returning. Because sometimes revenge doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it just needs patience, and sometimes, the smallest inconvenience at the worst possible moment is enough to teach a lesson someone thought they'd never have to learn. After he walked out of the store, everything went back to looking normal. The lights stayed bright. The music kept looping the same songs. Customers kept coming in with their questions and complaints and expectations. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside me, something had shifted quietly. Like a hairline crack forming where there hadn't been one before, I stood behind the counter with my hands folded the way I'd been trained to, posture straight, voice calm, face neutral, and I helped the next customer like nothing had happened. That's the strangest part about retail. You can be insulted to your face, and 5 seconds later, you're expected to act like you're fine. Like you weren't just reduced to something small and disposable by a stranger who won't remember your name. His words kept replaying in my head while I worked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just looping in the background like a song you can't turn off. Or you stupid. The sentence itself was simple, almost lazy. But what made it hurt was how easily it came out of his mouth. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't looked embarrassed. He hadn't even sounded angry. He'd sounded certain, as if my intelligence was something he could measure in seconds just by looking at where I was standing. That's what stuck with me. Not that he was rude, but that he felt entitled to be. I've been called worse in retail. Anyone who's done this job long enough has. But there's a special kind of humiliation that comes when someone talks down to you publicly, confidently, and without consequence. It makes you feel exposed, like the counter between you isn't protection but proof that you're trapped, proof that you can't respond the way you want to, proof that the rules apply differently to you. I kept replaying the moment, wondering if I should have said something smarter, sharper, more dignified. But the truth is, in that moment, I didn't have the option to defend myself. Retail doesn't allow dignity when it conflicts with customer satisfaction. As my shift went on, I did everything I was supposed to do. I restocked shelves. I answered questions. I smiled when I was spoken to. I apologized when things weren't available. And with every task, the pressure inside my chest grew just a little heavier. It wasn't explosive anger. It was worse. It was controlled anger. The kind you're forced to compress and carry around because letting it out would cost you your job. The kind that teaches you patience, not because you're calm, but because you have no other choice. When I went on my break, I sat in the staff room with a cup of coffee I barely tasted. The room was quiet, the air stale, the walls covered with notices about policy updates and shift changes. I stared at the table while my thoughts spiraled. Why did he feel so comfortable saying that to me? Why did he assume I hadn't already checked the system? Why did my position behind a counter make him think he was smarter, better, more deserving of respect? That's when it hit me. Men like him don't see retail workers as people with knowledge or experience. They see obstacles, temporary inconveniences standing between them and what they want, and the most frustrating part was knowing he'd walk away from that interaction feeling justified. He'd probably tell himself he was just being direct, that he didn't mean anything by it, That if I felt offended, that was my problem. He wouldn't replay the moment later. He wouldn't feel embarrassed. He wouldn't lose sleep over it. He'd forget my face by the time he reached his car. Meanwhile, I'd be the one carrying it home with me, folding it into the pile of quiet humiliations retail workers collect over time. Asterisk. That's when my mind drifted back to the bag, to the receipt, to the return policy I knew by heart. Retail trains you to memorize policies not just to enforce them, but to protect the company. Receipt required for returns. Without one, the process becomes slow, frustrating, and humiliating for the customer. Manager approval, government-issued ID, manual system entries, store credit only, no cash, no card refund. I'd seen customers lose their patience over it more times than I could count. I'd seen grown adults slam their hands on the counter over a missing piece of paper. And suddenly I realized something important. I hadn't broken any rules. I hadn't lied. I hadn't denied him service. I'd simply followed procedure. And the system, for once, was working quietly in my favor. That realization didn't make me feel powerful in a dramatic way. It made me feel calm, centered, balanced, because the revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It didn't hurt him, financially or physically. It didn't risk my job. It just added friction to his life at the exact moment he'd least wanted. And the best part was that he'd never be able to trace that frustration back to me. He wouldn't know when it started. He wouldn't know who caused it. He'd just feel it. As I finished my shift and clocked out, I kept thinking about how often retail workers are expected to absorb disrespect without reacting. How we're told to be professional, which really just means quiet. How customers are given the benefit of the doubt while employees are expected to be endlessly forgiving. That night, walking home, my feet aching, my shoulders heavy, I realized something had changed. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely powerless. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't argued. I hadn't even frowned. But I had reclaimed something small and personal: control. I didn't know if he'd ever try to return that speaker. Maybe he'd love it. Maybe he'd keep it forever. But if he didn't, if he ever stood at a counter like mine, already irritated, already convinced the world was against him, then that tiny folded receipt would be waiting. And in that moment, when frustration boiled over and patience ran out, he'd feel just a fraction of what he made me feel that day. And honestly, that felt fair. Asterisk, I didn't know when it would happen. But I knew it would. That's the thing about people like him. They walk out of stores convinced they made the right choice, convinced they were smarter than the person behind the counter, convinced their irritation was justified and temporary. But irritation has a way of returning when you least expect it. As the days passed, I found myself imagining him with that speaker. Maybe he set it up at home, confident, already forgetting my face. Maybe the sound wasn't as rich as he'd hoped. Maybe the bass rattled in a way that annoyed him. Maybe it was something small, something insignificant. The kind of flaw that wouldn't bother a patient person, but would slowly drive someone like him crazy. I could picture it clearly. Him standing there, arms crossed, jaw tight, telling himself he'd just return it, easy, simple. A quick errand. In and out. That's how customers always think returns work. They imagine a smooth, painless process. They imagine handing over a product, getting their money back, and leaving without friction. What they don't imagine is standing under those same fluorescent lights, already annoyed, already feeling inconvenienced, only to be told they need something they don't have. A receipt, a tiny piece of paper that suddenly holds all the power. I imagine him reaching into the bag for the first time, fingers brushing past plastic, expecting the receipt to be right there on top. I imagine the pause when it wasn't, the small frown, the irritation blooming just under the surface as he shook the bag slightly, as if the paper might magically fall into his hand. He would open the first bag, probably tearing it without thinking. Then the second, tape stretching, plastic ripping. That confidence slowly draining from his body as he realized something wasn't adding up. I imagine him checking his pockets, his jacket, his car. Maybe even his wallet, convinced for a moment that he'd put the receipt somewhere safe. That's when frustration turns sharp. That's when people stop being polite. Because now it's not just about the product anymore. It's about control slipping away, and then, finally, I imagined him finding it, or almost finding it. That tiny, crumpled square of paper wedged deep between layers of plastic and hardened tape residue, something technically still there, but practically unusable without effort. I imagined the way his fingers would struggle to pull it out cleanly, the way it would tear just enough to make him panic, the way the ink might smudge slightly from adhesive. Because returns aren't just about having a receipt, they're about having a readable one, a presentable one, proof that you followed the rules. I imagined him standing at a counter, just like I had been, explaining himself to another employee, maybe another woman, maybe someone younger, someone newer, someone he'd talked down to again without realizing he was repeating a pattern. I imagined him saying, "It's right here," with irritation in his voice, holding out that mangled piece of paper like it was an accusation. And I imagined the employee squinting at it, typing into the system slowly, apologizing calmly, saying things like, "I'm sorry, sir, this might be difficult to process." Or "I'll need to call a manager," or "Do you have your ID with you?" Those words always land like an insult to people who are already frustrated. I've seen it dozens of times. The moment a customer realizes they're no longer in control, their tone changes, their posture stiffens, their patience evaporates. I imagine him feeling that heat rise in his chest. The same heat I'd felt when he leaned toward me and called me stupid. That same tightening of the jaw, that same internal scream to be taken seriously. And the irony of it all is that he would never connect the dots. He would never think back to the woman behind the counter who smiled politely and did exactly what he asked. He would never realize that the inconvenience he was experiencing was rooted in the way he treated someone else. That's what made it satisfying in a way that surprised even me. Not because he was suffering, but because the universe felt balanced. Again, he had turned a simple interaction into something demeaning for me. And now, without anyone raising their voice, without anyone breaking policy, that same energy was circling back to him. Quietly, patiently, exactly the way retail teaches you to survive. I thought about how often people underestimate retail workers, how they assume we're uneducated, temporary, replaceable, how they speak to us in ways they'd never speak to a coworker or a friend, and yet, we're the ones who know the systems. We're the ones who understand the fine print. We're the ones who know where the rules bend and where they don't. We're the ones who can make an experience smooth or painfully slow without ever technically doing anything wrong. That day, I didn't weaponize anger, I weaponized knowledge. And that felt like a kind of justice I'd never experienced before. At night, lying in bed, I replayed it all again, not obsessively, but thoughtfully. I realized this wasn't just about him. He was just a symbol, a stand-in for every customer who'd ever snapped their fingers at me, every person who'd rolled their eyes when I tried to help, every stranger who thought wearing a name tag meant I deserved less respect. This wasn't revenge fueled by cruelty. It was revenge fueled by restraint, by years of swallowing words, by choosing silence over confrontation because silence was safer. And the most honest truth is this: I didn't feel bad. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't even feel smug. I felt complete, like something unresolved had finally settled, because the world rarely offers retail workers moments where dignity is restored. We don't get apologies, we don't get acknowledgments, we don't get justice, we just get the next customer. But this time, I got something else. I got closure, even if I never saw his face again. Even if I never witnessed his frustration firsthand, knowing it was waiting for him was enough. Some people think revenge has to be dramatic to be satisfying, yelling, exposing, public humiliation. But those kinds of revenge are risky. They're loud. They leave scars. What I learned that day is that the most effective revenge is the kind that blends into the system so well that no one questions it. The kind that feels like bad luck. The kind that makes someone mutter under their breath, shake their head, and wonder why things never seem to go their way. And if that moment taught him even a fraction of patience, even a sliver of respect for the next person behind a counter, then maybe it did more good than harm. There's a strange comfort in knowing something is inevitable. Not immediate, not dramatic, but unavoidable. Days turned into weeks, and life moved on the way it always does. New customers, new complaints, new smiles that didn't reach my eyes. But every now and then, usually during the quiet moments of my shift, my mind would drift back to him. Not with anger anymore, but with curiosity. Like waiting for a storm you know is coming, not because you want destruction, but because the air has been too still for too long. I didn't need to see his face again to feel satisfied. The idea alone was enough. Somewhere out there, a man who thought nothing of calling a stranger stupid was carrying a bag that held a problem he didn't know existed yet. Asterisk. What people don't understand about retail is how deeply you come to know frustration. Not your own, but everyone else's. You recognize it in body language before a single word is spoken. The tight jaw, the shallow breathing, the way someone grips a product a little too hard. I'd seen it hundreds of times at the return counter. Customers walk in convinced the interaction will be quick, already planning the rest of their day. And then, slowly, reality shifts. The tone changes, the patience drains, the entitlement cracks. I imagined him walking in exactly like that, confident, slightly annoyed, expecting compliance. In my head, the scene played out in painful detail. He places the speaker on the counter with a dull thud, arms crossed, eyes already scanning the store like he's daring someone to challenge him. "I want to return this," he says, not rude yet. But not friendly either, neutral, leaning toward impatient. The employee asks for the receipt. That's the moment, that tiny pause, that flicker of annoyance he tries to hide. "It's in the bag," he says, too quickly, too confidently. Because he still believes he's in control, the bag is opened. Then the second one. Tape resists. Plastic stretches. The receipt isn't there. Not where it should be. Not where it makes sense. That's when the silence gets heavy, because silence at a counter isn't empty. It's full of judgment, expectation, and the growing realization that something has gone wrong. He starts searching, more aggressively now, his movements sharper, his breath louder. The employee waits patiently, trained not to rush, trained not to help unless asked. Minutes pass, and then the receipt appears. Or part of it does, crumpled, stuck, damaged, barely legible. "I found it," he says, relief mixing with irritation, holding it out like evidence. But relief doesn't last long in retail. Because policy doesn't bend for tone. The employee examines it, types slowly, frowns just enough to signal trouble. "I'm sorry, sir," they say, and that apology isn't personal. It's procedural. This might be difficult to process. That's when his patience snaps. Not loudly. Not yet. Just enough for the edge to show. "What do you mean difficult?" he asks, like the concept itself is offensive. And that's when the system takes over. Manager required. ID needed. Store credit only. Each sentence lands like a small slap to the ego, because returns aren't just transactions, they're emotional exchanges. They're about validation, about being believed, about being treated as important, and suddenly, he's not. Suddenly, he's just another customer being told no in polite language. I imagine the way his face would flush, the way his voice would rise just enough to draw attention, the way he'd glance around, aware that other people might be watching. That's when frustration turns into humiliation. That's when people feel small. I don't know if he yelled. I don't know if he argued. I don't know if he stormed out or stood there seething. I'll never know. And strangely, that's what makes it perfect, because this revenge wasn't about witnessing his downfall. It was about knowing it existed. It was about understanding that disrespect doesn't disappear just because it goes unchecked in the moment. It lingers. It echoes. It finds its way back when you least expect it. What stayed with me most wasn't the image of his frustration, but the contrast. He had spoken to me like I was incapable. Like my role defined my worth. And yet, it was that very role, that very system I understood better than he ever would, that ultimately held the power. Retail teaches you that power doesn't always look like authority. Sometimes it looks like policy. Sometimes it looks like procedure. Sometimes it looks like a tiny folded receipt pressed between layers of plastic and tape. After that realization, Settled in, something inside me changed. I still smiled at customers, I still did my job, but the weight I'd been carrying felt lighter, because I no longer believed the lie that I was powerless. I'd seen what quiet resistance looked like. I'd felt what it meant to reclaim dignity without risking everything. And that knowledge stayed with me long after the memory of his face began to fade. There's a misconception that revenge has to be cruel to be satisfying, that it has to hurt deeply, publicly, permanently. But the truth is, the most effective revenge often feels like inconvenience, like delay, like friction. It mirrors the exact disrespect it answers. He inconvenienced my humanity. I inconvenienced his certainty, nothing more, nothing less. Balanced. And maybe, just maybe, the next time he walked into a store, he thought twice before leaning across a counter and insulting someone who was only trying to help. Or maybe he didn't. Either way, the lesson existed, quietly, patiently, waiting in the space between expectation and reality. Just like I had. Some stories don't end with shouting. They don't end with apologies, confessions, or dramatic confrontations. Some stories end quietly, the way real life usually does. With a feeling instead of a scene. Weeks passed, then months, and I never saw him again. No angry customer demanding a manager, no loud voice echoing through the store, no familiar face storming toward the counter with that same irritated confidence. And that was okay, because this story was never about watching him lose. It was about me realizing I didn't have to. Retail teaches you something strange about time. Moments blur together, faces fade, but emotions linger. Long after I forgot what he was wearing. Long after I forgot the exact model of the speaker. I remembered how it felt to be spoken to like I was less than human. And I remembered how it felt to quietly take that power back. That feeling stayed with me in ways I didn't expect. It showed up in how I stood a little straighter behind the counter. In how I spoke a little more confidently when explaining policies. In how I no longer automatically assumed that being polite meant being weak. There's a lie that people like him believe. The lie is that respect is optional when you think someone can't fight back. That people in service jobs are there to absorb frustration, not to be treated like equals. And for a long time, I believed a different lie. I believed that swallowing disrespect was the price of professionalism, that staying silent meant staying safe, that dignity was something you sacrificed to keep a paycheck. That day showed me something else. It showed me that dignity doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from understanding the rules better than the people who try to use them against you. I thought about all the times I'd gone home exhausted, not just from work, but from being talked down to, from being interrupted, from being treated like my intelligence ended at the counter. I thought about my coworkers, especially the younger ones, especially the women who'd cry in the break room after customers crossed lines and walked away, untouched. People don't see those moments. They don't see the way disrespect accumulates, how it settles into your shoulders, how it follows you home, how it makes you quieter over time. This wasn't just my revenge. It felt like something larger, like a small correction in a system that rarely corrects itself. And here's the part that surprised me the most. I didn't become bitter. I didn't start treating customers worse. If anything, I became calmer, because I stopped feeling helpless. I knew now that not every injustice needs an immediate response. Not every insult deserves your energy. Some people will never understand empathy in the moment. But systems remember, policies remember, time remembers, and when those things align, justice doesn't have to shout. It just has to exist. Sometimes, late at night, I still imagine him standing at that counter, frustration written all over his face, wondering why such a simple task turned into such a mess. I imagine him muttering under his breath about bad service, about stupid rules, about how inconvenient everything is, and I imagine the irony passing right over his head. Because the inconvenience he feels for 10 minutes is nothing compared to the years of quiet disrespect retail workers endure every single day. And for once, the scale tipped back, even if only slightly. This story isn't about encouraging cruelty. It's not about hurting people for fun. It's about fairness, about balance, About reminding ourselves that being kind costs nothing, but being cruel often costs more than people realize. If he'd spoken to me with basic respect, none of this would have happened. He would have walked out with his speaker and a normal receipt and a normal experience. His insult created the journey he never wanted to take, and that's the simplest form of karma there is. I still work retail. I still smile. I still help people find what they need. But now, when someone tries to belittle me, I remember that I am not powerless. I remember that my role doesn't define my worth. And I remember that sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't about winning. It's about restoring your own sense of self after someone tried to take it from you. Asterisk. So if you've ever been talked down to, if you've ever been insulted by someone who assumed you couldn't respond, if you've ever gone home replaying a moment you wish had gone differently, let this be your reminder: you don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to break rules to reclaim dignity. Sometimes all you need is patience, awareness, and the quiet confidence that the world has a way of evening things out. Because the truth is, respect given freely costs nothing but disrespect. Disrespect always finds a way to come back around. Asterisk. If this story made you feel seen, if it reminded you of a moment you swallowed your words and carried the weight home with you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more real stories where justice doesn't scream, it waits. And tell me in the comments, what's the quietest revenge you've ever witnessed, or the one you wish you'd taken? Asterisk.